He stood there stiff, shoulders pulled tight, hands locked together like they were holding back more than just nerves. The kind of posture you see when a man has been fighting battles long before he ever walked into a courtroom. His eyes kept drifting down, not because he didn't care, but because sometimes looking up feels heavier than looking down when life has been pressing on your chest for years. His voice cracked as he spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. He explained how he had missed the payment, how the notice came, how the fines stacked on top of other fines, how every bill felt like another brick added to a wall he was already struggling to climb. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't beg. He simply told the truth the way tired people do, quietly, carefully, hoping someone might finally hear it. The room went still. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence, but the kind where everyone suddenly realizes that what's happening is bigger than paperwork and penalties, bigger than rules and procedures, bigger than a simple guilty or not guilty. Because this wasn't about a ticket. This was about a man who had been working 2 jobs and still falling behind. A man who skipped meals so his kids could eat. A man who paid rent late, not because he didn't care, but because sometimes you have to choose which fire to put out first when your whole life feels like it's burning. He kept apologizing. "I know I was wrong," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I'm trying to fix it. I just need time." And in that moment, you could see it, how deeply he blamed himself, how much shame he carried. How he already felt like he had failed before anyone else had a chance to judge him. This is where most people expect the hammer to fall. This is where most systems would simply read the fine, issue the penalty, and move on to the next name on the list. But sometimes justice is more than punishment. Sometimes justice is understanding. He was asked about his family, about his work, about how long he'd been struggling, not as an interrogation, but as a conversation, the kind of conversation that says, "You matter enough for me to listen." And when he answered, the dam finally broke. His eyes filled, his breathing changed, his hands started shaking. He tried to wipe his face quickly, embarrassed, as if tears somehow made him weaker. But those tears weren't weakness. They were exhaustion finally being allowed to breathe. They were years of pressure releasing all at once. They were the silent scream of someone who has been carrying too much for too long. And then came the decision. Not loud, not flashy, not dramatic, just firm, calm, clear. The fine was reduced. The extra penalties were removed. The deadlines were adjusted. He was given time, real time, breathing room, a chance to recover instead of being crushed. And when he realized what had just happened, he froze. He looked up slowly, like he wasn't sure he heard correctly. "Are you serious?" he whispered. He was told yes, that this wasn't a trick, that someone had finally chosen to see him as a human being, not just a case number. His shoulders dropped, his jaw trembled, and then the tears came. Freely, openly, without shame. A grown man crying in a courtroom not because he was being punished, but because, for the first time in a long time, life had stopped pushing down and had finally offered a hand up. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was nod. All he could do was say thank you over and over again, his voice breaking every time he tried to finish the sentence. You could see it in his face. This wasn't just relief. This was hope. This was dignity being returned. This was someone finally feeling like he hadn't been forgotten. Because when someone meets you at your lowest point and chooses compassion over crushing you, it doesn't just change your case, it changes your heart. It reminds you that you're not invisible. It reminds you that your life still has value. It reminds you that sometimes one decision made with humanity can lift a person back onto their feet. And that man didn't walk out of that courtroom feeling like a failure. He walked out standing taller. He walked out breathing easier. He walked out believing, maybe for the first time in a long time, that he could still turn things around. Because sometimes the most powerful decision isn't the one that punishes. It's the one that gives someone their chance back. He stood in the quiet space between the bench and the floor, not quite in the light and not fully in the shadow, the way people often stand when they feel unsure if they deserve to be seen at all. His shoulders were curved inward, not from poor posture, but from years of carrying weight that no one else ever noticed, the kind of invisible weight that presses on your chest long before it bends your back. His hands were folded tightly, knuckles pale, as if he were holding together more than just his nerves, as if his grip alone was keeping his life from unraveling in front of strangers. His eyes stayed lowered, not out of disrespect, but out of habit. Looking down had become easier than looking forward, easier than facing a world that had trained him to expect disappointment. The lines on his face were not just signs of age, but records of worry, late nights, and mornings that began before the sun and ended long after the strength in his body had been spent. Each line carried a story of a man who had learned to survive quietly, who had learned that complaining rarely changed anything, and that enduring was often the only option left. When he finally spoke, his voice came out softer than he intended, like it had traveled through too many heavy thoughts before reaching the air. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to sound important. He spoke the way people do when they are already tired of explaining their lives to systems that only listen for mistakes. He talked about missing the payment, about the notice that arrived folded inside an envelope that felt heavier than it should have, about how one small error had grown into something that now stood in front of him like a wall too tall to climb. He described days that began with calculations instead of coffee, mornings spent counting what little money was left before deciding which bill would be delayed again. Rent, utilities, food, transportation, school supplies, medicine, every expense lined up like quiet threats, each one demanding attention, each one insisting it was the most important. He spoke about how he would sit at the kitchen table late at night, staring at the numbers, hoping that if he looked long enough, they might rearrange themselves into something kinder. He mentioned working extra hours, picking up shifts whenever they were offered, coming home with feet that ached and hands that felt stiff and swollen, but still waking up the next day to do it all over again because stopping was not an option. He talked about skipping meals, telling his children he wasn't hungry, laughing it off so they wouldn't notice, while his stomach twisted and his head grew light, not from dieting, but from sacrifice. He admitted that sometimes he would stand in the grocery aisle calculating which items could be put back, which foods could be replaced with cheaper versions, which small comforts had to be surrendered for another week. His voice wavered slightly when he spoke about his family, not because he wanted to use them as a shield, but because they were the reason he kept pushing even when he felt like he was slipping. He spoke about wanting to be an example, about trying to show his children that responsibility mattered, even when life made responsibility feel like punishment. He said he didn't want them to grow up thinking that giving up was normal, even though some days giving up felt like the only way to breathe. He explained how the missed payment wasn't rebellion, wasn't carelessness, wasn't laziness. It was the result of choosing between two urgent needs and hoping that the one left behind would wait just a little longer. He talked about the fear that came with opening the mail, the way his chest tightened every time he saw an unfamiliar envelope, the way his hands would shake slightly before tearing it open, already preparing himself for whatever new burden might fall out. He admitted that he felt embarrassed standing there, that it took everything in him to speak in front of strangers about his private struggles, that he wasn't used to asking for understanding, that he had been taught to keep problems to himself and solve them quietly, even if that meant breaking a little inside in the process. He said he didn't want pity, he just wanted a chance to fix things without being buried under consequences that would make fixing them impossible. The room seemed to listen, not just to his words, but to the pauses between them, to the moments where his breathing caught slightly, to the way he swallowed before continuing, to the subtle tremor that appeared when he spoke about how long he had been feeling like he was falling behind, no matter how hard he ran. He spoke about feeling like life had become a race with no finish line, where the effort was constant, but the progress was invisible. He described the quiet shame that followed him into public places, the way he avoided eye contact at times, the way he felt smaller in rooms where people spoke about vacations, new cars, and weekend plans, while his own plans revolved around survival and stretching what little he had. He said he often felt like he didn't belong in conversations about success, even though he was working harder than he ever had in his life. He talked about lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying mistakes that felt bigger than they should have been, wondering how one missed payment could grow into something that now threatened his sense of stability. He admitted that he had started doubting himself, questioning whether he was failing as a provider, as a parent, as a man, even though he was doing everything he could think of to hold his world together. His words carried the weight of someone who had been strong for too long without relief, someone who had learned to endure without expecting rescue, someone who had grown used to solving problems alone because help felt uncertain and understanding felt rare. He wasn't standing there to argue. He wasn't standing there to fight. He was standing there because he had reached a point where endurance alone was no longer enough, and because he needed someone to hear what his life actually looked like beyond the paperwork. He finished his explanation slowly, carefully, as if he were setting something fragile down on a table, afraid that one wrong word might cause it to shatter. His hands loosened slightly, his shoulders still heavy, but no longer pulled quite as tight, his eyes lifting just enough to see if what he had shared had landed anywhere that mattered. The room did not change on the outside, but something shifted in the air the moment his words settled. The chairs were still in their places, the walls were still plain, the floor still carried the same dull shine, yet the space felt heavier, as if every person present had suddenly become aware that what was unfolding was more than a routine process. It was no longer just a matter of rules and recorded details. It had become a moment where a human story stood exposed in front of a system that was usually too busy to pause. He stood quietly, hands still folded, eyes uncertain, waiting for the familiar sound of consequence that he had already prepared himself to receive. His breathing was shallow, controlled, as though he had trained himself to stay calm, even when he expected impact. He did not ask again. He did not try to defend himself further. He simply waited, the way people wait when they believe the outcome is already written. Instead of immediate judgment, questions came, not sharp, not dismissive, but calm and patient. They were not aimed at trapping him in contradiction, but at understanding the shape of his life. He was asked about his work schedule, about how long he had been managing on reduced income, about how often he had to choose between responsibilities. The tone was steady, almost gentle, and that gentleness caught him off guard more than anger ever could. He answered carefully, surprised by how much his voice was trembling now that he felt seen rather than accused. He spoke about early mornings and late nights, about how he tried to avoid missing a shift, even when his body felt like it needed rest, about how he worried constantly that one more problem could push everything out of balance. With each answer, the space between him and the bench felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. The conversation did not rush. It did not interrupt him. It allowed him to finish his thoughts, even when they came slowly. It allowed him to breathe between sentences. It allowed him to be more than a file number. And in that pause, something subtle but powerful began to take place. His shoulders relaxed slightly, his grip loosened, his eyes lifted more often, meeting the room instead of avoiding it. The focus shifted from what he had done to what he was facing. The discussion moved away from strict measurements of fault and toward the reality of impact. What would another heavy penalty mean for his household? What would happen if the pressure continued to grow? How much strain could a person reasonably carry before stability turned into collapse? He listened as the possibilities were laid out, not as threats, but as considerations. He began to realize that this was not a moment designed to make him smaller, but to understand how he could move forward without being crushed in the process. The language used was not cold. It did not carry the edge of impatience. It carried the tone of someone weighing responsibility with humanity. He nodded often, not out of submission, but out of recognition. For the first time in a long while, someone was acknowledging the difference between unwillingness and inability. Someone was separating his character from his circumstance. Someone was acknowledging that hardship does not cancel effort. As the conversation continued, his breathing deepened. His hands began to rest more naturally, instead of clenching. He blinked slowly, his eyes growing shinier, not yet from tears, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being understood in a place where he had expected only correction. The idea of adjusting the outcome was introduced quietly, without ceremony, not as a reward and not as a dismissal of responsibility, but as a way to make responsibility possible. The words were measured, the explanations were clear, the changes were structured, realistic, designed not to excuse the past, but to protect the future. He did not react at first. He seemed unsure whether he was hearing possibility or simply another version of procedure. His head tilted slightly, his eyebrows drew together in confusion. He waited for the conditions, the hidden costs, the part that would make it harder again. When he realized that the adjustments were real, that they were meant to reduce the immediate burden rather than add to it, something in his expression softened. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, then closed again, as if his voice needed a moment to catch up to his emotions. The space grew quieter, not because of command, but because everyone present could feel the weight of what was happening. This was not a loud victory. This was not a dramatic reversal. It was a careful turning of direction, a choice to guide rather than push. His eyes filled slowly. He tried to hold it back, blinking more often, pressing his lips together, shifting his weight as if movement might keep the feeling contained. But relief has its own momentum. It moves through the body the way tension once did, loosening muscles that have been locked for too long. His shoulders dropped noticeably, as though a heavy bag had been lifted from his back. His breath came out longer than it had gone in. He nodded again, not quickly, but deeply, with the kind of nod that comes from being emotionally unsteady but grateful beyond words. He attempted to speak, but his voice wavered. He cleared his throat. He tried again. The words were simple, but they carried more meaning than long explanations ever could. Gratitude, disbelief, and release were all woven into that quiet response. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not dramatically, not for attention, but because the emotion had arrived faster than his pride could prepare for it. His face flushed slightly, his jaw tightened, then relaxed. He took another breath, grounding himself in the reality that the weight pressing on his life had just been made lighter. He stood differently now. Still respectful, still careful, but no longer braced for impact, no longer preparing for collapse. He stood as someone who had just been given room to stand. He did not move right away after the decision was spoken. His body seemed to hesitate, as if it needed confirmation that what had just happened was real and not something his mind had imagined in a moment of emotional fatigue. His eyes stayed fixed forward, slightly widened, his mouth parted just enough to show that he was trying to breathe through a rush of feeling he hadn't prepared for. For so long, he had walked into situations expecting resistance, expecting consequences, expecting to have to defend himself, that the sudden presence of kindness felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. The first visible change was in his shoulders. They sank slowly, like something heavy had finally been lifted off of him. It was not a dramatic movement, but it was noticeable, the kind of subtle release that only happens when tension has been stored in the body for a long time. His hands loosened at his sides, fingers uncurling from a grip he hadn't realized he was holding, as if his body was finally receiving permission to rest. His breathing deepened, the shallow, controlled breaths giving way to longer inhales and slow exhales that carried sound with them. Each breath felt like it was emptying more than air, like it was pushing out weeks of worry, months of pressure, and years of silent endurance. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm that had been missing from him when he first stood there. He looked down briefly, not in shame this time, but in disbelief, as if he were checking the ground to make sure he was still standing in the same place, as if the floor beneath him had not shifted into something unreal. He pressed his lips together and nodded slowly, the kind of nod that carries more emotion than agreement, the kind that says he is trying to hold himself together in a moment that feels too big to manage quietly. His eyes began to shine, the moisture collecting at the corners before he could stop it. He blinked once, then again, trying to clear his vision, but the feeling continued to rise, pushing gently but firmly against the walls he had built around himself. His face tightened slightly, the muscles around his eyes and mouth drawing inward as if his body were trying to contain something that wanted to spill. He lifted his head again, his gaze moving slowly across the room, not focusing on anyone in particular, but absorbing the reality of where he was and what had just taken place. For the first time, he did not look like a man bracing for impact. He looked like a man who had just been told that the road ahead was still difficult, but no longer impossible. His throat moved as he swallowed, the motion exaggerated by how dry his mouth had become. He tried to speak, but the first attempt produced only a breath. He paused, inhaled again, and tried once more, his voice coming out softer than he expected, thin with emotion, but steady enough to be heard. The words he offered were simple. They were not rehearsed. They were not dramatic. They did not come from a place of performance. They came from a place of relief, from a place of gratitude, from a place of feeling seen after a long stretch of invisibility. His voice trembled slightly, then steadied as he repeated himself, as if saying it more than once made the moment feel more real. He wiped his face quickly with the back of his hand, then lowered it again, embarrassed by the tears, but not trying to hide them completely. His cheeks flushed, the color spreading as his emotions continued to surface. He took another deep breath, then another, grounding himself in the sensation of being present instead of preparing for punishment. His posture continued to change. Where he had once stood with his weight shifted defensively, he now stood more evenly, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared, not with tension, but with balance. The small physical changes mirrored the internal shift taking place, the quiet rebuilding of a sense of dignity that had been slowly worn down by constant pressure. He nodded again, this time more firmly, as if confirming to himself that he had heard correctly, that the opportunity placed in front of him was real and not fragile. His eyes lifted higher now, meeting the space ahead without flinching, without shrinking, without the guarded hesitation that had marked his earlier presence. He inhaled deeply and let the breath out slowly, a faint sound escaping with it, a sound that carried exhaustion but also release. His lips pressed together again, then curved slightly, not into a full smile, but into something softer, something quieter, something that hinted at hope rather than celebration. He shifted his weight once, then again, preparing himself to step away, to return to his life with a lighter burden than the one he had carried into the room. The future was still uncertain, his challenges were still real, his responsibilities were still heavy, but the path in front of him no longer felt closed. He stood for a moment longer, taking in the reality that a single decision had altered the shape of his immediate world, that a moment of understanding had given him more than reduced numbers or adjusted terms. It had given him breathing room. It had given him the feeling that he was not alone inside his struggle. It had given him a reminder that his efforts still mattered. He nodded one last time, slowly, deliberately, his eyes still bright, his expression steadying, his body now aligned with a sense of possibility rather than fear. He turned slightly, preparing to walk away, carrying with him not just relief, but the quiet belief that he could continue, that he could recover, that he could rebuild.